global movement of people from North Korea, South Korea, the US, and beyond. And we are working together to advance freedom for all North Koreans. So we do this by increasing North Korean people's access to information and technology, by rescuing North Korean refugees and empowering them to be agents of change, and mobilizing international support and solidarity. We believe the North Korean people can achieve their freedom in our lifetime, and each of us here today and around the world can help make that vision a reality. So before we jump into things today, just a few quick housekeeping reminders. We want to spend as much time as possible answering your questions, so feel free to start dropping them into the chat right now. One of my colleagues is in there and she will be chatting with all of you and gathering your questions. If you guys want to get started, you can go ahead and drop into the chat some comments about where you're joining us from and what brought you here. Next, if for some reason you're having any issues like with your sound, we found that the quality is usually better when you tune in from a computer instead of your phone. So if we freeze at some point on the screen, you can always leave the event and try to rejoin, and that usually solves the problem. Lastly, we do have the live captioning enabled. So if you would like to use that, be sure to turn it on. And if you're having any issues at all, please send us a quick message in the chat. All right, now let's get into it. So today I am honored to be joined by Lina Yoon. She's a senior researcher at the Asia Division for Human Rights Watch, focusing on the Korean Peninsula, mostly North Korea. Lina has visited North Korea 3 times since 2003 and has met with over 400 North Koreans outside of the country. Her research focuses on the North Korean government's endemic and widespread rights violations, including arbitrary detentions, lack of due process, torture, forced labor, and discrimination against at-risk groups, including women, children, and people with low socioeconomic and political status. Lina is also one of the authors who led the report, A Sense of Terror Stronger Than a Bullet, which was released last year in 2024. The report examined how between 2018 to 2023, North Korea implemented increasingly oppressive policies, and these were primarily justified by the COVID-19 pandemic. The report highlighted the worsening human rights environment and the expanded internal surveillance and violence, the increased economic hardship and severe food insecurity that resulted from the borders being sealed. Following that report over this past year, she actually interviewed very recent North Korean defectors who escaped the country between 2020 and 2023. Those insights were consistent with the findings in her original report. So Lina, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We are super grateful to have you here to talk a little bit more about these incredibly important reports and to also give our supporters a chance to get to know you and hear from you. Our team actually had an opportunity to read through this report together, and we learned so much. And to be honest, despite working on this issue day in and day out, it's always difficult to dive deep into details around these types of everyday systematic and systemic abuses, and the strong sense of fear that was really kind of came across in the report that these escapees were counted because of the threat of extreme punishments. So welcome, Lina, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. Before we jump into talking about the report a little bit, would you mind sharing a little bit about your story, maybe your background, what led you to Human Rights Watch, and your interest in the North Korea issue?
Sure. So I'm a journalist by background. So I was a journalist for 12 years, and actually in 2000 I had like 2 really marking moments on related with North Korea, which are probably totally the opposite of what everybody here is thinking. But I had the opportunity to go to North Korea in 2003 for the first time, and I really didn't really know that much about North Korea, and I thought it was the worst place I've ever been in my life. And then a year later, I met a first North Korean woman in 2004 in the Chinese border with North Korea. I had gone to China to cover the 4th round of the 6-party talks, and I didn't know at the time, but she was actually a very representative story of what North Korean women were experiencing at the time. She had escaped some repeated times from North Korea to China, escaping hunger. She had been sold and she had been shackled into a bed until she got pregnant. Then she escaped. She was caught again, resold, and it was just a horrible story. It was like hours of interview where I couldn't stop crying and crying and crying. And then I thought, this is it. Like, I just don't want to work on North Korea ever again. And and I think my journalistic career is really about like how I escaped North Korea. Like I was working in Seoul at the time. I went to Mexico as far as I could. And then somehow I ended up back in Beijing covering the Olympics in 2008. And then I ended up staying there. And somehow just fate was just kind of pushing me back again and again to meet more North Korean people some way or another. And so in 2014, I joined Human Rights Watch. It was really kind of like that moment where I just embraced that I needed to work on North Korea and I just didn't have another choice. But also at the same time, I was a journalist that was doing lots of feature stories and I was covering like third, fifth day stories. And so that kind of also made it kind of a bit natural to like jump into work that really goes into like in-depth research as well. And then go one step further into doing advocacy to actually come up with solutions to the problems.
Well, not the usual story. I know we talked about this a little bit, but it definitely seems like the work that you've done over the last near decade has been just so critical to the space and for NGOs like us to be able to really learn and understand so much more. So we're so happy that you somehow managed to find your way back and continue doing this work over the last decade. Um, I want to jump into the reports a little bit. And so I know there's the large report that we're talking about that was published in 2024, and then kind of a mini report that you published this year as a follow up. And these reports really paint quite a devastating picture of sort of this increased repression in North Korea since 2018. What do you think are some of the most underreported or maybe misunderstood aspects of this sort of recent period that you covered in these reports?
I mean, I guess like when you mention now, what's misunderstood about North Korea, I want to just go back again into kind of more of a big picture and be thinking that what I get a lot is like, yes, North Korea is very repressive, it's horrible, and we know this very well now. Nobody's denying it. And I think one of the things that people don't really understand and that it does show and it's addressed in this report is that the North Korea is actually constantly changing. And North Korea was designed using the Soviet model and like the communist model. It was like actually improved through the decades to do better repression and better control of its population. And then in the 80s, it starts weakening. In the 1990s, the system collapses. In the 2000s, like North Korea is somehow trying to rebuild. And then in 2010, it's a period of internal closure, but like extreme experimentation and growth in some ways inside North Korea. And then really since 2018 until 2023, we see this like period of extreme repression, both externally and internally, and massive repression of the population in all the aspects where control of the state had loosened up since the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that sometimes people think this is North Korea. No, this is so repressive. This is it. But I think like what I always like to repeat is that, excuse me.
Okay. You okay?
Yeah.
Take your time.
Sorry.
That's okay. Are you okay?
I don't know what. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm better.
Okay.
No, like, so what I was mentioning is that I feel like sometimes like people are thinking like that North Korea is static and that there's no opportunity for change,
Right.
but there is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important point to make because, especially prior to kind of, especially the COVID time period, we saw quite a lot of change happening in North Korea, especially at a ground level and a grassroots level, and particularly after the famine period as well. And so I think that that's very true and something that perhaps is a little bit less known, oftentimes, or is not something that people immediately think about when they think about North Korea is actually how much it has changed in the last few decades. And then once again, through the COVID pandemic period, again, how much North Korea changed, but unfortunately, really sort of in a backwards way. Um, the reports that these two reports, they were based on interviews that you had conducted. So the first was really based on interviews that you did between May 2021 to March 2023. That was with 38 escapees who had escaped between 2017 and 2019. And so I know included in that, it was pretty diverse. You had 6 former government officials, 10 North Koreans living in South Korea who were still in contact with relatives inside North Korea, and then 12 former traders who were familiar with cross-border trade. So they had been kind of in the border area. So I'm wondering, when you interviewed them, how did you earn the trust of sort of these interview subjects? And was there anything that really stood out to you about their testimonies, especially as compared to North Korean escapees before this time period?
Sure. I mean, just to clarify that the people we interviewed, most of them had escaped between 2017 and 19, but depending on the experience that they, some people had like left earlier on.
Okay.
Um, um, the I mean, the interviews with North Korean people are always very difficult. It's very, we have always extreme methodological issues, and it is important to explain very clearly what the goal of our research is, and also like explain to them that they shouldn't be forced to participate in these interviews, and just kind of build trust and rapport.
Mm-hmm.
But because the report was covering 2018 to 2023, but like most people had escaped prior to 2019, I was feeling quite insecure. Like, the information, as you know, information access has been blocked. Like most of the information that was going in or coming out into North Korea had already starting to like shrink since the UN Security Council sanctions were implemented in North Korea since 2017. And and so I had to kind of just like change the methodology and widen how I worked. And North Koreans, so I had to like rely on a smaller number of interviews, but like we had to kind of expand the ways where you try to confirm information. So for
Okay.
example, I think reports from Daily NK or RFA or VOA, I used to consult them, but I
Mm.
wouldn't use them as a proof of like something really happening because I wasn't able to reconfirm that
Right.
what they had reported, right? Like I didn't have access to the ground. So I heavily relied on witness testimony, people who had
Mm-hmm.
left, and then they were telling me what they had directly seen. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
for this report, like I had to do a lot of like media analysis where I had to start quoting this media organizations, but also recheck
Mm-hmm.
whether that information was through other sources accurate or at least representative of things that were
Mm-hmm.
happening in North Korea that I had confirmed as well. And then we also did satellite imagery analysis of 321 kilometers across the border. I had which I chose 6 areas. So I picked the two most like the end areas, and then 2 areas that were very very secure already, where there was a lot of smuggling going on, and then 2 random areas where you could see in the map that like it's in the middle of nothing. And
Mm-hmm.
and then we found that even in those areas, there was like all the areas had been fenced with double double layers of fencing.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, that's interesting. I think that when we were reading through that report, that was also something that was very surprising. You know, we knew that for a long time these kind of border areas were being fortified, but I think it was pretty surprising to find out just to what extent some of the fencing was extending and how extensive that was. Um, I'm curious to know, you've been doing this research now for about a decade. Um, was there anything sort of in these more recent interviews you've done with people who have defected in the more recent years as compared to maybe like research you were doing 5 years ago, or even in the beginning of when you joined HRW, in terms of things that had changed about maybe North Korean people's awareness or about the issues or the things they were talking about, or how maybe they were talking about the government or about their situation?
Mm.
Did you notice any of those kinds of differences in testimonies?
Um, I feel so maybe I guess like going back again, like to the bigger picture, when I think of the North Koreans I used to meet that had escaped in the mid 2000s, everybody was talking about the shock of the collapse of the information control and how they really believed that North Korea was such an amazing place, and then that
Mm,
like all their trust in the government had broken.
mm,
Um, and since I feel like, especially since 2009, when the currency reform happened in North Korea, which was a really big event domestically, and it was the first time the North Korean people saw with their own eyes that their everyday life difficulty was because of the government policy. Like in previous
mhm,
years, even if the ultimate fault was from the government, from the North Korean government, they always thought it was U.S. sanctions, natural disasters, and so on. So since the people after 2009, they were more comfortable being critical of the government, and they were just there was like this clarity that at least for the people that were living on the border area, there was like no, there was like clarity on what was happening in the outside world. The people that left in recent years, I guess one of the things that really like struck me was that while in North Korea, information is like accurate information is extremely difficult to access. No, most of you who are here know that there's no internet access, there's no unsanctioned media access, only propaganda is available inside North Korea. And among the information that's not available is laws. So North Korean people don't know what laws exist out there, even if they're curious about the laws, even if they're being in pretrial detention, they wouldn't know what law they've broken, and like what recourse could exist according to
mm,
the legal system. But then during these interviews, what I saw was that every single person, all the 8 people that we interviewed, knew exactly, almost word by word, the reactionary ideology and culture rejection law.
mhm,
And I mean, I have it here, but like for example, there was this one young, very brave man who had escaped that told me this law was a law so important for the people to know that that it was a message that such behavior would be severely punished. I
mhm,
heard about it during a seminar by the Iminban. They told us all to write the law up and stick it out our doors. The Iminban distributed text to write. Authorities wanted the law inside our homes, so we would see it every day. And after 2 weeks or so, the head of the people's unit passed by to check we had the sign. And I mean, this sounds like a very like simple descriptive situation, but I mean, I feel it's very representative of kind of that increased like strengthening repression on this one law that actually can punish with the death penalty the distribution of Korean media content. And it shows kind of the brutality of the state.
Yeah, well, I want to actually talk about that a little bit. And before I jump into that, I just want to remind everyone to please be sure that you're dropping your questions into the chat at any time. for Lina. So that actually goes into kind of this other question because, you know, you really detailed how essentially Kim Jong-un, he doubled down on isolation, especially through the 2020, through kind of the anti-reactionary thought law and then these other laws. And it was not just that law, but through so many other laws that either were changed or were introduced during that time. And so how did that affect the lives of ordinary North Koreans really day to day?
I mean, so many people were asking, you know, like during the pandemic period, like when is North Korea gonna open up? And then the standard question is that, of course, it's just like my estimation that North Korea won't reopen to the outside world unless their systems controls are totally like finalized. And I think, you know, it's very clear since late last year that North Korea's reopening its borders, I mean, partially and selectively. And that's been really that's been really something that we can see, you know, across the board. So, you know, there have been massive, like a really large number of new laws that have been passed in 2023. There's kind of like this effort to kind of re-systematize the new North Korea that we have right now. And so I think like there's a lot of work to do for any future or current North Korea and analysts and experts on all these laws that were just passed in the recent like 2-3 years. But for example, there have been, you know, all these like 3 laws that are kind of repressing information access and expression. They're banning, you know, speaking in like South Korean style, but also like they're banning informal market activity, which used to be, you know, the main lifeline for ordinary North Korean people. They are requiring every business owner to report to the government what they're doing. And for example, even food distributions being further centralized from the government. So so we see kind of this like return back into kind of like that strong implementation of the Songbun system, where people that are in Pyongyang and closer to Kim Jong-un will have a much, you know, more privileged life, whereas the farther you are both physically and on kind of that perceived loyalty system to the leadership, like it's going to be much harder now to get, you know, profit-making opportunities, you know, like economic activities or access to food and basic necessities.
Yeah, I think that these changes in laws were very impactful, obviously, on the everyday lives of North Koreans. But I want to kind of just go back and touch on this. And this is a little bit selfishly, since this is a key area of our work. And I think especially work that's being done in this space, increasingly so, which is trying to increase information access for North Korean people inside the country. And I think that these laws are really a huge indication of the impact of foreign media, the impact that outside information and technology is having inside the country on North Korean people. The regime would feel so threatened by that and so concerned that they would be instituting these types of laws, these not only kind of widespread and multiple kind of various types of laws, but even just the level of punishment, right? The extent of punishment for some of these things. So what are some of the things that have changed, right? Like there was always punishment for consuming foreign media or being caught with this kind of stuff, especially pre-COVID. But again, in this time period and that you were looking at for this report and more recently, how has like that level of repression and that kind of punishment changed?
Yeah. I mean, in North Korea, like anti-state crimes are like very, very big, right? So anything that the government decides is a crime, it is an act that goes against the state can be a crime. And within that behavior, it includes kind of the consumption and distribution of foreign media or this, you know, like of giving information about North Korea to the outside world. But because it's so all encompassing it just kind of like it goes and comes in waves, right? Like, so there were periods where it was a government priority, so it was like persecuted. But like if it's a lower priority, like then maybe for 6, 10 months, nobody would really care. Maybe something would happen again, and then like so you kind of see that like back and forth, and then also it really depended on who the leader was, right? Because Kim Jong-il, for example, didn't really care so much about North Koreans escaping or providing information to the outside world, whereas Kim Jong-un considers it a top priority. And one of the first things he did when he reached power back in the late 2020, in 2011, was really closing the border and saying that it's going to implement a 3-layer like mosquito net, like so information doesn't really go in and doesn't go out. He increased punishment on for anyone trying to escape the country. So maybe back in the period of Kim Jong-il, women or men, both men and women that would like go to China to make money and like get caught would be in prison for like 6 to 8 months to a year, whereas with Kim Jong-un, punishment increased to 7 years. So, and then with the pandemic, and this is really kind of, it's proof of how disruptive foreign information is inside the country. Well, is, you know, like these exclusive laws that are targeting, you know, this information. And one of the several of the interviewees described public executions for people distributing media to either friends or, you know, to sell media content. And for example, Kim Il-hyuk, who escaped in mid 2023, he said that he had not seen any public executions before 2019. And then since 2020, he started seeing public executions every couple of months. But then by 2023, he was seeing one, I don't know, like 2 or 3 every like few weeks. So it's just,
Wow.
but we're really looking into kind of like an extreme amount of repression. And it's also a form of like reaction from the North Korean government, because in the 1990s, because of the economic collapse, the systems collapse along it. Whereas in 2020, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean economy was already suffering from the UN Security Council sanctions impact, which had targeted 90% of North Korea's commercial profits at that time, focused on really keeping control of like the military and the police and like the security in the country. So while the economic situation for the North Korean people was like getting worse and worse and worse, and, you know, extremely difficult, the control of kind of those systems, and then also the repression of expression became even more important. Because if you start hearing people that are going through extreme difficulty, you know, in a population that has become a bit more used to complaining and raising concerns about the government, that's really a big part of possible threat. And that's why there's this massive increase since 2019 on ideological control of the population.
So I think kind of along those lines, because of this massive increase in the ideological repression, again, the reason why foreign media has played such a critical role, because that severely undermines and erodes sort of the North Korean government's kind of ideology, the kind of indoctrination and education. And so you touched on this in the report, you know, talking about how the regime has made it even harder for North Koreans to now be able to access outside information. They've increased the threat of kind of, you know, punishment for consuming, sharing, accessing foreign media, technology, but they've made it even harder also for North Koreans to be able to even access that. Or even to be able to leave the country. I think that was one of the most stark things. You know, we talk about executions, but the shoot on sight order is not something new. I think this had something like that had existed previously, where we had heard of cases decades ago when North Koreans were first escaping across the border, with incidences of border guards who would perhaps shoot at North Koreans who were trying to escape. But the fact that the government actually, you know, had this order to shoot on sight to prevent people from leaving the country, I think was something that was very kind of stark. It was very shocking to see that. Can you talk a little bit more about that, right? Like, it's not just about information and stuff coming in, but it was also about this order for things not to get out, people, information.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The because North Korea, because Kim Jong-un considers a priority that people cannot escape the country. He's used the COVID pandemic as an excuse to implement extremely severe measures to control the population, and including the shoot-on-sight order, which was implemented in August 2020 to protect the population against COVID. And these measures are still in place today, but the shoot-on-sight order is only against North Koreans, not on the Chinese side, right? And so I think that's kind of like very clear what the intention is, especially like today, where all the world's already moved on from kind of like the COVID pandemic world.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely, we've seen the impact of the borders being sealed and this kind of increased punishment and how much more difficult it's gotten for North Koreans to escape. From our side, we do not know of a case of anyone who has actually been able to leave North Korea since the pandemic across that border into China. I think most of the cases that we've heard of have been predominantly folks that have left across the DMZ or come by boat or have come from third countries. If any of the folks that you had interviewed more recently, did any of them come directly from across the border into China?
I mean, I don't think I can talk about like the specific details on like how people left because of security reasons, but I think your estimation is very accurate.
Yeah, I think that was definitely something that we have seen has not returned. The number of people who have been able to escape prior to the pandemic, at least for our organization, about half of the people we were helping were coming straight out of North Korea and coming through the underground in their escape. Whereas after the pandemic, almost everybody that we've been able to help, no one has come straight out of North Korea, and we don't know of any cases of people who have been able to cross that border into China and escape out of the country. And so I think that that's been something that's also been like very disheartening to see. But again, just further emphasizes how much the government has truly kind of increased this priority on keeping the border shut, even despite the pandemic being over.
Yeah, I mean, the few that are able to escape even into China, like the escaping from China right now into a third country, that even that process with China's increased repression and surveillance, and also like because of the measures that were put in place, during the UN Security Council sanction implementations and during the pandemic, that everything has been kind of like this combination that just made everything like so much harder.
Yeah, and I think that this was also reflected in kind of the new report that you're working on, which is essentially for North Korea, even for China, but particularly for North Korea, the pandemic was the perfect excuse and reason to be able to kind of really seal the country back up and to really increase their repression and their control again, especially when we saw over the last few decades, as we had talked about earlier, some of these changes that were actually happening on a ground level and some of the kind of relative increased freedoms that people were experiencing inside the country over the last few decades prior to the pandemic. So I think that that's also been something that's been very difficult and kind of unfortunate to see, as we don't see a lot of that kind of coming back even post-pandemic. I think one of the natural questions that a lot of people are going to have then is what kind of role do you think that like defectors or NGOs and governments can play in helping to break the isolation or really countering the regime's control?
I mean, we have so many, I mean, we have a number of like civil society organizations, and some of them, that are led by North Korean escapees. And at this moment, especially now, as repression is increasing so much, getting information inside and outside of the country, doing investigation and exposing rights violations and doing analysis on what's happening in North Korea, but also, you know, the work that you guys used to do, like rescuing as many North Koreans as possible, resettlement support, supporting next generations and amplifying the voices of the North Korean people are extremely important right now. And I mean, and this is, also given the current geopolitical environment, both in the U.S. and South Korea right now. We have, funding cuts from the U.S. government that are affecting the CSOs that are seeing existential threat, and we have the new president in South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, who comes from the Democratic Party, and which is a party that has traditionally been repressing North Korean human rights groups, and I mean, and represents South Korea's ideological divide between the conservatives and progressives. We have like progressives that are supportive of human rights in South Korea and the world, but are denying or repressing rights, right? Like the fact that violations are happening in North Korea, and then we have conservative parties that don't care about human rights, but use North Korean human rights as a tool to attack North Korea and the Democratic Party as well. So at this moment, I feel for us the focus needs to be in how do we ensure the survival of these groups that have been doing this incredible work for the last 20 years or more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you seen any sort of response or impact that the report has had on policy or in helping to increase public awareness, especially within the international community? Was there a specific outcome or impact that you had hoped the report would have?
I mean, so when I was thinking of the report, one of the big recommendations that we had was for the Human Rights Council to mandate a report that would follow up on the Commission of Inquiry, which had been published in 2014. The Commission of Inquiry report was really the first UN document that found that crimes against humanity were being committed in North Korea, and which is really relaying like the severity of the situation. And we haven't had a comprehensive report that's really looking into North Korea since then. And so in September, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights will publish a report, and it's a 10-year assessment of the since 2014 to 2024. And I guess we want to highlight that report as much as we can. And it's important to promote it, so we have a moment where people are rethinking about again on the North Korean human rights issue, and then what's really happened in the past years as well.
Mm. Yeah, and again, even just from our side, I know that the reports have had a significant impact. They always do. We rely heavily on the research and reporting that comes out of organizations like Human Rights Watch to be able to help guide our own kind of guide and inform our own strategies and our own knowledge on the issue as well. So I know that it's had such a huge impact, even just within the community as well. It looks like we have a lot of really great questions, and so I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we'll take a few questions from some folks who have joined us today. Let's start off with, it looks like Kate, we have two questions from Kate. So the first is around how are the markets doing under these crackdowns? You did touch on this very briefly before when we talked about some of these these laws that have changed or new laws that have been introduced kind of during this last era and how they've impacted North Korean people. So can you talk a little bit more about what's been happening with the markets really kind of over these last few years?
Sure. I mean, it's very difficult to know what's really happening right now. I mean, the most recent interviewees that I spoke with, like, left in 2023. What we know is that commercial trade has been so I'll just go back into, so ordinary North Koreans until 2019 were relying on official trade, informal trade, and smuggling. So, and then also domestic distribution, informal domestic distribution across the country, right? And so these are kind of like the four things that used to like fill up the markets of products that give job opportunities to North Koreans to be able to make money, and then would allow them to like go to a market that have some sort of like level of products and buy them. And so what has happened since the pandemic was that informal trade like almost stopped for 3 years and restarted last year. Informal trade is extremely controlled, so it's probably going to be extremely rare that is happening right now. Smuggling is like all gone. Like only maybe the very small amount of smuggling that probably is happening is the one that's led by the military or the secret police or the government. And then distribution of products now cannot happen in informal ways. It can only be happening through the formal channels. So, so just kind of looking on kind of like these four elements that, you know, used to be kind of like the lifelines of, you know, like anyone that would be living in kind of maybe an urban area that has some sort of like trade access, it looks really green. Right? Like, I don't think there's that much product that is tailored towards the needs of the ordinary people. There's a lot of product going in to tailor the needs of Pyongyang. There's probably very limited distribution that's tailored to the needs of ordinary people, especially in rural areas or areas that are not like in the big cities. But everything easily goes to Pyongyang where it's really needed, and it's a priority for the government. So I haven't like had like any like direct reporting on kind of like the state of the markets at this moment, but I would imagine that life is extremely difficult still, and then access products, especially if you're not in an urban area, like much more difficult than it used to
be. Yeah, I think that was one of the reports about 2 years ago. I think the BBC had done something where they had been able to actually get access to some North Koreans who were inside of the country. And then I think, of course, we had heard of reports of like, again, like starvation, people like dying of hunger, even reports of suicide, like things getting so desperate, especially during the pandemic era, because of how little access people had actually to food or to the markets. And then again, a lot of that as a result of the borders being sealed shut. Or their inability to be able to reach and access food and things like that. So I think that was quite surprising and shocking to hear about since that time period. And I know that the borders have been somewhat opened a little bit. So have we seen that situation improve? Have we heard, especially from the more recent interviews that you've done, that has improved a little bit?
So I mean, there were reports of like starvation, but I mean, I don't want anyone to be thinking that it was something that was like comparable to the 1990s,
right?
Or
Not
where
at
people
all.
would be like imagining seeing like dead people on the streets and kind of things like this. Like that was really not happening in North Korea. The systems were really in control. And the Inminban, you know, the people's units and the local government officials were under extreme pressure not to allow people to die of hunger, right? So they would have to like get their own money and somehow find ways to kind of make these people survive. So, I mean, I had heard reports of like people in urban areas, and usually urban areas are like the ones that maybe get affected earlier from, because in the or rural areas, like while they are poorer, at least they have access to nature. It was in urban areas where there were reports of these, but like the kind of, I think like I mean, it's not, I haven't heard like direct reports, but like what I envision is more something that's people that are unable to, like they are not strong enough to go out and like be able to make money no, and
Yeah.
there's no opportunities to make money, so they can't really eat, and then they're
Yeah.
so weakened,
Yeah.
and they eventually just die at home, or like situations like this.
Right.
I'm assuming that now that the formal trade has increased, like that type of situation, probably local governments are like trying to prevent.
Hmm.
But there's really no way to know what this means.
Right. Um, one of the questions that we got is asking if there are increased dangers for defectors reaching out to family members who are still in the country through electronic devices compared to before the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a definitely like we have this law that says that it's banned to talk to to give information to the outside world, and that's like something that's like proactively repressed. People are really looking into like the government's really looking into constantly in trying to crack down on people that connect people from the outside world, but also people that bring money from outside to North Korean, to North Korean families.
Hmm.
So it is very dangerous. The prices of sending money compared to 2019 like have increased massively, and even like the possibility of of um, of getting like insurance that your money may reach your family members, that's even gone. Like it's like a risk that you need to embrace eh, at this moment if you want to try to send money to North Korea, for example. And and in the past before the pandemic, whenever you'd send money, people um, would be able to like connect with their family members, like they see them counting the money and so on. Whereas now it's like that you just get like a photo and that's it. And you just need to kind of like decide whether that's like enough for you or not.
Yeah. We've definitely heard of some of those reports as well. I mean, prior to the pandemic, when remittances were getting sent, it was like, maybe 30, 40% off the top was going to kind of the brokers facilitating that. I think during and post pandemic, we've heard it's 50, 60%, sometimes, even more than that. Barely anything is getting into family members as well. And so kind of all over the space, I think, in terms of some of the anecdotes that we've heard from some of our North Korean friends.
Yeah.
Um, Another question here is about the situation in China. Has the situation in China where women, I'm assuming women are being sold and often become victims of sex slavery, has this issue been addressed with China at the UN?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that comes up like a lot on North Korean events at the UN, for example. I
Hmm.
think issues around forced repatriation are something raised like constantly. I
Hmm.
remember last year there were like at least like four side events that were happening at the Human Rights Council in Geneva in March, and all of them raised issues around forced repatriations.
Hmm.
But I mean, in China's, its own repressive state that is executing horrific crime, rights violations against its own population, and there's like it's like we're facing a really big barrier to be able to like effectively address that as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's definitely something that we have just continued to see as well. There are still thousands of these women still in China right now. Um, and some of these are the very women that we are still actually able to help escape, despite this time period where North Koreans are not able to leave the country. More recently, many of the individuals we have been able to help rescue have been majority a lot of these women who were trafficked and were in China and are kind of in these situations, in these kind of forced marriages and situations of trafficking.
Yeah.
Um, One of the questions, a lot of questions actually that came through, and so just going to kind of group them all together here about the kind of current state of politics. There's been a lot going on, and so there's some questions about sort of the attitude of the new South Korean president towards North Korea, particularly towards North Korean defectors, NGOs, towards this issue. What types of challenges do we anticipate? And then, even with the current Trump administration, what is the perspective on North Korea? What do we think is going to be kind of the approach of this administration on North Korea?
I mean, we're very concerned about, what's going to happen with this North Korean human rights groups in South Korea under Lee Jae-myung. I mean, what we have seen in the past few weeks, for example, has been already groups that are working quietly, without raising any issues to try to like send information inside North Korea through the DMZ, totally unable to even reach the border areas. Sorry.
Hi.
And so that's a small kind of situation, but like I feel it's very representative of like kind of like the chilling effect it can have on how the North Korean groups are able to like navigate like the South Korean space right now. And then in the US, I mean, I mentioned briefly, US has cut funds to foreign aid, and it's very concerning because for a really long time in the US, the North Korean Human Rights Act has been a partisan initiative that was supported by the whole of Congress. And they've been giving millions to kind of send information inside North Korea, support resettlement programs, and like conduct documentation and analysis work on rights violations inside the country. And this type of information has been really crucial to kind of to inform US policy, but also initiatives like the Commission of Inquiry, which like fed from all this information that had been built from all this work that was supported by the US. And so I guess at this moment for us, one of the top priorities in the US is really getting members of Congress to reauthorize the North Korean Human Rights Act, which expired in 2018 and in 2022, and that in previous year was still being covered by appropriations in Congress, but because of the current recent changes in the past few months, that's really not an option anymore. And we really need kind of that mobilization from people that are asking their Congress members to do that, and then to ensure that this information is getting in and out, and then this support continues. And then also included within the law is the North Korean special envoy, who would be a high level advocate for these issues at the global level.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that. We'll come back to that as well, kind of what you touched on there in terms of what folks can do to help support that effort. But we're gonna kind of wrap it up. I have one last question for you. And so for anyone else that we didn't have a chance to answer your question, I'm sorry. I know the time is always so short. So if there is any questions that you really want to have answered, feel free to reach out to us at link, message us, or email us. And if you're not already subscribed, be sure to subscribe. We're currently in a series where we are talking about different aspects from Lina's report and about the issue, kind of updates on the issue and what's been going on. So the last question I want to ask you, Lina, is I guess, if you could get a message through to every North Korean person who's inside North Korea today, what would that message be? What would you want to say to them?
I mean, this makes me think of like, many North Koreans that I have met through the years and through my work that, that whenever they heard about what we do and what other groups do, they thought, oh my God, like this fills me with hope. And so I'd like to tell them that, you're not alone. And, there's many people working to increase freedom and dignity for North Koreans, even if they don't know it.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think a very, very important message that we hope that North Koreans inside the country know or can know through opportunities for us to continue to reach them through information and things like that, so that they are aware of the efforts, the multitude of efforts that are kind of being done here on the outside. And just, I think it would be very encouraging if they knew how many people, not just many people who have joined us here today, but around the world. We have supporters in over 80 countries around the world, and that's only for our organization. So I can only imagine from Human Rights Watch and from so many of the other NGOs how many people around the world are standing with the North Korean people. And so I think that is such a beautiful and inspiring and important message that the North Korean people should know. So before we wrap it up, anything else that you would like to say, Lina? Maybe anything we didn't get to cover, or anything that you would like to say to people on the call?
I think we said we're going to mention that you're going to share this form. And
Yes.
so I would just like to ask everyone to really be very proactive in reaching out, members of Congress, members of, Foreign Affairs Committee, and members of the Senate to really work really like very quickly on this act. And then you're gonna share this form, and so please fill it up, send it, and ask 3 friends to also do that.
Yes. Thank you so much. So as Lina said, we have, I'm sure everyone here today, first, I just want to thank you for joining us. I've learned a lot from this conversation with Lina. I'm sure we're all wondering, where do we go from here and what can we do? And so first, if you've been supporting the work of Human Rights Watch, Link, other NGOs on this issue, I truly want to thank you. You have no idea how vital your support has been, essentially, in being able to produce kind of groundbreaking reports like this, to continue to do the work that we've been doing as well. And so especially during this time, as Lina mentioned, when funding is being cut and groups are struggling to sort of figure out how they're going to continue this work. So, despite those challenges, we all continue to remain so committed to this work and in standing with the North Korean people. So please continue supporting. And if you are not yet, please consider supporting these organizations and the work that's being done. And as Lina mentioned, we're going to drop this link in, if it's not already in the chat. Please take 5 minutes. That's all it takes. We've even put a template letter for you and some talking points in there for you to write a letter to your members of Congress. You can also call their offices if you want to look them up. Let them know that you care about the North Korean people and you want to see the US government's continued commitment on this issue. It's critical that we do this right now, as soon as possible, and just continuously. We're going to have something more coming out in the coming months, but we want to make sure that people on the Hill are hearing from their constituents and they know that this issue is so important. Even in the midst of everything else going on in the world, we will not want the North Korean people and this issue to be forgotten. So again, the link should be in the chat. If it takes you to our website, super easy way. It will pre-populate for you. Take a few minutes, customize that letter with why the issue is important to you. Get that sent, please, and go ahead and ask at least three of your friends, maybe 20 if you want, to please take a few minutes and to fill that out and to send that in. It is so helpful. And one of the easiest things that we can do right now is just a quick follow-up from today's event. Lina, thank you so much. Oh, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to share a few organizations that I think are doing crucial work, and some of them include the North Korean Reform Radio, Unification Media Group, Daily NK, Citizens Alliance, NKDB, Transitional Justice Working Group, and Han Voice. And just please check them out online, and and of course link on HRW. But please check them up and because they really need further support. And I know Link has done already previously an emergency fund fundraiser, and thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about those groups, you can check them out on your own. We also did a blog post that kind of outlined a few of those groups so you can learn a little bit more about them. And there's a direct link in that blog post to all of those organizations. So very important that we continue to support this overall movement. We are not a big movement at all, small but mighty movement that will not give up and will continue to do this work. So thank you all again so much for joining us, for your continued support. It makes this work possible. And Lina, thank you so much for joining us today and for the incredibly important research and work that you're doing at Human Rights Watch. Everyone else, thank you for tuning in. I hope that we will see you again at another Link event. Bye-bye.
Thank you.